They say the dead speak only in echoes, soft and slow and forgotten. But on that rain-slicked Tuesday afternoon, my grandfather roared from the grave, his voice inked in gold foil on a letterhead that smelled of money, arrogance, and bureaucracy. I didn't need to read the words to know something was wrong. The envelope alone had weight, like a verdict. It was thick, cream-colored, almost self-important, sealed with a waggy precision that made my own trembling fingers feel dirty in comparison. Rain clattered against the cabin roof like urgent whispers, like a warning I couldn't yet decipher. I stood under the cedar awning, boots soaked, breath fogging, and tore it open. Notice of civil incorporation and eviction. It was written in a typeface that tried too hard to be polite. Beneath it, bolded language outlined an ultimatum: vacate within 72 hours or face legal consequences. The reason: aesthetic noncompliance and unauthorized structural modifications. I actually laughed out loud, a bitter, disbelieving sound that vanished into the storm. My grandfather's cabin, my home, was being labeled a threat to property values. I stepped inside, dripping onto pinewood floors that still bore the burn marks from my childhood mishaps. Grandpa Jack used to say the imperfections made it human. If your floor doesn't know your story, he'd grin. You're not living hard enough. The fireplace still held the ashes from the last winter burn, untouched since early March. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen older than sliced bread, and a great room that had heard more laughter and grief than any therapist's office. That was my crime, apparently. Living somewhere that didn't match the HOA's vision board of suburban perfection. The signature at the bottom: Victoria Wellington, president of Pine Lake Estates Homeowners Association. I'd seen her before, gliding through town like she was allergic to eye contact with anyone who wore flannel, always in cream suits, always driving a white Range Rover that looked like it had never touched a gravel road. She was the kind of woman who carried her own weather system cold, curated, high pressure. I dropped the letter onto the worn wooden table and stared at the fireplace. My grandfather built this place with his hands, milled the beams himself, dug the foundation during a summer that left his palm blistered and blackened. The dock out back. He laid every board with a rusted hammer in the stubborn belief that sweat mattered more than money. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't need to. Back then, the lake wasn't framed by iron gates and manicured hedges. It was raw, messy, real. Like us. The phone rang. Earl Peterson's name blinked across the screen. Earl had owned the cabin across the cove for over 50 years. He was the kind of man who taught history because he remembered most of it. "Jack, you get one too?" he asked, his voice stretched tight across miles of worry. I didn't need to answer. He already knew. "They're giving us 90 days, he continued. "Unless we upgrade the cabins or sell to some development company." "They gave me 72, I muttered. "What? That can't be legal." "They're calling my dock repairs unauthorized construction." Earl let out a slow whistle. "Your grandfather built that dock before Victoria was even born." "Hell, I helped him lay the posts." "They're trying, Earl, but I'm not going quietly." I hung up with a curse and headed for town. The roads slick with resentment and rain. Something didn't smell right. This kind of thing, redistricting, rezoning, whatever sanitized term they used to steal land, didn't just happen overnight. Someone had planned this. Someone with money, power, and a plan that didn't include people like me. Sarah Montgomery worked at the county records office. She'd known my mother in high school, and she'd been running the place with quiet efficiency since I was a teenager. If anyone could make sense of the madness, it was her. I found her hunched over a stack of manila folders in her cramped office behind the public counter. "Jack Edwards," she said, eyes narrowing. "I was wondering when you'd show up. You've heard, this is Lakeside. Word travels faster than mail here." I showed her the letter. She read it in silence, her lips pressing into a thin, disapproving line. "They filed the boundary adjustment back in February," she explained. "Richard Wellington submitted it under Pine Lake Development Group. It was approved 3 weeks ago, and they didn't notify property owners. There was a legal notice in the Lakeside Gazette, the paper nobody reads unless they're looking for bingo schedules. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. I followed her into the back, where old maps were rolled like ancient scrolls and stacked beside overflowing cabinets. She dug through a drawer, then another, until her fingers found a dusty binder that smelled like mildew and forgotten promises. "This," she said, laying a yellowed map on the desk, "is Pine Lake as surveyed in 1939. Before your grandfather bought the cabin." I leaned over the parchment, trying to make sense of the faded lines and looping cursive annotations. My eyes stopped on one margin note, barely legible. "What's this?" I pointed. She squinted. "That's referencing an original land grant. According to this, the lake itself and a 50-foot perimeter around it was deeded to a Joseph Edwards in 1923 as compensation for surveying the county." My breath caught. Joseph Edwards was my great-grandfather. Sarah's fingers danced over the keyboard, pulling up property records that hadn't seen daylight in decades. Deed transfers, tax receipts, hand-signed wills. "Jack," she said finally, her voice reverent, "you don't just own the cabin. You own the lake and the shoreline." I didn't speak. Couldn't. The storm outside had quieted, but inside me, something louder had begun to stir a wildfire of memory. Grief, and the kind of righteous fury that only comes when someone tries to erase your entire bloodline with a spreadsheet. All this time, I thought I was holding on to scraps. Turns out, I was holding the keystone, the very thing the Wellingtons had built their fantasy around, and they didn't even know it. As I left the records office with copies of everything, the letter from Victoria folded carefully into my coat pocket, a strange calm settled over me. Not peace, not yet, but clarity. This wasn't just about a cabin anymore. It was about history, legacy, identity. They thought they could erase us with bylaws, but they didn't know the land still remembered our names. And now, so would they. The rain had stopped by the time I got back to the cabin, but the air was still heavy, like it hadn't decided yet whether to breathe relief or foreboding. The trees around Pine Lake stood silent, soaked, as if they too were holding their breath. I parked my truck by the dock. My dock. I reminded myself and sat behind the wheel for a long moment, hands on the steering wheel, staring out at the water. Not just a lake anymore, not just a cabin. A buried inheritance wrapped in mud and bureaucracy, older than any homeowner association, older than the manicured luxury homes that now dotted the shoreline like parasites feeding on nostalgia. The weight of it wasn't lost on me. I wasn't just a man fighting eviction. I was the legal owner of everything they built their empire upon, and I needed help. Not the kind you find in courts first, but the kind that sharpens strategy before you draw the sword. I made a call. Martin Reynolds picked up on the third ring, his voice dry and alert, like he'd been expecting trouble since breakfast. "Martin," I said, "we need to talk." Less than 2 hours later, I was sitting across from him in his office above the lakeside hardware store, the smell of old paper and varnished wood heavy in the air. He looked like a history teacher who moonlighted as a legal fox, suspenders bracing a thin frame, reading glasses perched low, but eyes sharp, always calculating. I laid the folder from Sarah on the desk and said nothing. He read like a surgeon, quiet, precise, pausing only to blink when something confirmed a long-held suspicion. He finally looked up. "Your grandfather told me about this," he said, tapping the old deed, 15 years ago. "Said it might be useful one day. Said you'd know what to do if the day ever came." I swallowed. There was a weird kind of ache in my throat that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with legacy pressing down on your lungs. So what now? Martin leaned back, laced his fingers behind his head. "First, we verify the title formally. That buys us time. Then we decide, do you want to sell that leverage or use it to shake the foundations of their little kingdom?" I thought about Victoria Wellington's cream-colored pantsuits and the steel-tipped smiles she wore like armor. I thought about Richard Wellington, the developer with a God complex, slicing up land that wasn't his with the quiet confidence of a man who'd never been told no. And I thought about Earl and Margaret across the cove, spending their golden years living in fear of being priced out of their memories. I want to use it. I said, let's remind them where the ground ends and who it belongs to. Martin smiled a slow, knowing curl of the lips that said he'd been waiting his whole career for a case like this. The next morning I woke before dawn. I didn't sleep much. Too many thoughts pacing my skull. I stood on the dock, watching fog rise off the lake like smoke from a giant, sleeping animal. I imagined all the ghosts of Pine Lake standing with me. Grandpa Jack, Joseph Edwards, the unnamed families who'd fished these waters long before anyone cared what a quartz countertop cost. It wasn't sentimentality, it was strategy. Sentiment was what they tried to market with their fake rustic signage and photoshopped lifestyle brochures. But what I had, story the real kind, the bleeding, blistered, sweat-soaked kind that built this place at one nail and mistake at a time. My phone buzzed. Earl, emergency HOA meeting tonight, he said. 6 o'clock, clubhouse. Of course, it was. Victoria never wasted time when power was challenged. She was the kind of person who saw conflict as invitation. I told Earl I'd be there, then told him not to tell anyone else. Surprise, as Martin said, is the only weapon that doesn't need a permit. That afternoon, I dressed in my best approximation of cabin owner Defiance jeans, flannel, and a jacket older than some of the HOA board members. I drove past the gated entrance of Pine Lake Estates, noting the security camera that turned lazily toward my truck, paranoia disguised as safety. The clubhouse stood at the center like a temple to good taste vaulted ceilings, massive glass walls, furniture arranged to discourage comfort. The HOA didn't do comfort. They did posture. Inside, people were milling around with wine glasses and matching opinions. Victoria was front and center. Of course, greeting everyone with just enough warmth to avoid accusations of frostbite. When she saw me, she blinked. Just once. Just enough to register that her chessboard had developed an extra queen overnight. She walked over, heels clicking against hardwood like a countdown. Mr. Edwards, she said. Her voice dipped in honey and threat. This meeting is for homeowners in good standing. I smiled. Something casual and dangerous. Your letter says my cabin is now part of Pine Lake Estates, so I figured that makes me eligible, unless the rules only apply when they're convenient. Eyes turned, conversations stilled. The room shifted ever so slightly, the kind of shift that happens before an avalanche. Her smile held, but the tension in her jaw betrayed her. You violated numerous community standards. Yes, and I've been discussing that with my attorney, I said, smoothly. Martin Reynolds. The name was a pin to her balloon. Her posture stiffened. Behind her, Richard appeared like a summoned demon. His expression unreadable, but his presence loud. Martin's an old man, he said, too quickly. This is a modern property issue. Outdated legal interpretations don't apply here. Interesting, I replied. He seems to think your entire development sits on misappropriated land. You might want to have your legal team look into that. Victoria's mouth opened, but no words came out. That, in itself, was a kind of victory. The meeting began. Victoria recovered quickly and launched into her agenda compliance timelines, buyout options, beautification standards. She used words like community cohesion and property value integrity like they were gospel. At one point, Richard stepped in to explain that non-compliant properties would be offered fair market purchase options before further action. Fair market. I nearly laughed. Fair to whom? To the retirees being bullied into selling, to the land being sterilized into sameness. And then came the bomb. Victoria announced that immediate compliance inspections would begin the following week. Some properties, she said, eyes flicking toward me, required expedited action. So that was the game. Crush the outlier. Scare the rest into submission. After the meeting, she cornered me by the exit, her tone low and syrupy. There may be a way to avoid legal complications, she said. 20% above market, clean sale, no eviction. I looked her in the eye. It's not about money, she blinked. Everything's about money, not this. She smiled tightly, the smile of someone used to getting what they want. Don't be foolish. That cabin is sentimental. We're offering progress. You're offering erasure, I said, and I don't deal in nostalgia. I deal in ownership. As I stepped outside, I saw Earl and Margaret by their old Buick, watching like the elders in a parable. They tried to buy me out. I said, "Please." They offered us too. Earl replied. Margaret nearly threw her iced tea at them. They're not just trying to clean up the lake, Margaret added, eyes fierce. They're trying to erase the people who made it. I nodded. Then it's time they remember who we are. Because this wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about power, about who got to stay and who got edited out of the picture. And tomorrow, when Martin and I walk into that clubhouse with paper older than every suit in that room, they'll learn one thing: some stories refuse to be rezoned. The morning of the confrontation arrived with the kind of quiet that felt deliberate, like the sky itself was holding its breath. No bird song, no ripples on the water. Even the wind seemed to hesitate as if it knew something significant was about to unfold at Pine Lake. I was already awake, coffee in hand, standing barefoot on the dock. It stretched out before me like a statement aged, weathered, defiant. This dock, built by my grandfather with no blueprint but memory and grit, had become a symbol of everything they wanted to erase. Yet beneath its rotting boards lay legal sovereignty, the ownership of the lake, the 50-foot shoreline, and everything constructed without permission upon it. It was no longer just nostalgia, it was leverage. Martin Reynolds arrived precisely at 4:15 p.m., driving a vintage Mercedes that looked like it had survived more legal battles than most courthouses. He wore a three-piece suit that had probably witnessed the Watergate scandal and still came out wrinkle-free. I, in contrast, wore the same flannel shirt from the night before and jeans clean enough to pass inspection, but worn enough to tell a story. As I stepped into the car with the folder of legal documents under my arm, Martin glanced at me and said, "Today, we're not just delivering papers. We're reintroducing history." The drive to the clubhouse was short, but every turn carried the weight of generations. As we pulled into the parking lot, a space that, according to every map and deed we now possessed, legally belonged to me, I saw something that made my lips twitch with satisfaction. Earl and Margaret, along with half a dozen other original cabin owners, were already gathered just outside the clubhouse. Some stood with folded arms, others leaned against old trucks or perched on tailgates. None of them carried signs, but their presence alone was protest enough. Pine Lake Estates had always tried to be exclusion in disguise, wrapping control in ribbon and bylaws. But now the old bones of the lake were showing through the luxury finish. Inside the clubhouse, the board meeting had already begun. Victoria Wellington presided at the center of a U-shaped table like a monarch passing judgment. Richard sat at her right hand, flanked by 5 other members whose facial expressions ranged from smug boredom to mild concern. The lighting was high, the chairs expensive, the air temperature exactly regulated, everything carefully calibrated to make sure discomfort only came from words, not the environment. When Martin and I entered, a wave of confusion swept through the room. Victoria faltered mid-sentence. Her eyes narrowed like a predator, catching the scent of something that didn't belong. "This is a closed board meeting. Mr. Edwards," she said sharply, "you'll need to schedule time through proper channels." Martin stepped forward, his presence quiet but undeniable. "Victoria Wellington, I'm Martin Reynolds, legal counsel for Mr. Edwards. Given the nature of the situation and the expiration of the eviction notice today, we felt a direct approach was warranted." Richard shifted in his seat, tension creeping into his carefully neutral expression. Martin opened the folder and gestured to me. I placed the first document on the polished table. "This is a cease and desist," I said. "Your notice of eviction is being challenged on the grounds of jurisdictional overreach and improper annexation." Richard reached for the paper like a man checking for a ticking bomb. The other board members leaned forward, brows furrowing. But I didn't stop there. I laid the second document beside the first with the kind of calm only possible when you know the truth is finally on your side. "This," I continued, is a notice of trespass and unauthorized construction. It concerns the clubhouse, the beach, and this very parking lot, all of which, according to original land grants and property deeds, were built on land that belongs to me. Silence crashed into the room like a dropped chandelier. Victoria blinked once, twice, then turned sharply to Richard, her voice tight and barely controlled. "Tell me this is a bluff." Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he skimmed the documents, flipping pages with increasing agitation. "There may be ambiguities in the original shoreline acquisitions," he admitted finally. The board erupted into murmurs. One woman at the far end whispered something to her neighbor, who promptly stood and left the room. Victoria's hands slammed onto the table, manicured nails clicking against the polished wood. "We vetted every purchase. We paid for these amenities. They're ours." Martin remained unflustered. "And yet, your development company never legally acquired the lake or its immediate perimeter. That land was deeded to Joseph Edwards in 1923 and passed down without interruption to his great-grandson. That's Mr. Edwards, standing right here." One of the board members, a man who'd been silent until now, spoke up. "What happens if this holds up in court?" Martin's voice was calm, measured. "Well, for starters, all eviction proceedings against Mr. Edwards must be immediately rescinded, and any further use of the clubhouse, beach, and parking facilities would require a lease agreement with the rightful landowner." Victoria scoffed. "You're blackmailing us." "No," Martin replied. "This is property law. Your organization prides itself on order, legal compliance, and community standards. I assume you'd prefer to resolve this without a lawsuit that could drag on for years." The room had grown still. Victoria stared at me with a kind of fury I'd only ever seen in people who were losing something they thought they'd already won. "You won't get away with this," she whispered. "You're just one man." I stepped closer. "I'm one man whose family has been part of this lake for nearly a century. And I'm not alone." I nodded toward the windows, where the silhouettes of cabin owners stood like a living memory. Richard rose slowly. "Perhaps we should adjourn and consult with legal representation." "Excellent idea," Martin said. "Already gathering our papers. We'll expect a formal response by noon tomorrow. After that, we'll proceed as necessary." As we turned to leave, Victoria's voice followed us like a final shot across the bow. "You're playing a dangerous game, Edwards." I paused. "Not a game, a reckoning." Outside, the gathered cabin owners met us with quiet nods and murmurs of approval. Earl clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You did good, kid," he said. "You reminded them this lake has a soul." I looked across the water. The clubhouse lights reflected off its surface like broken promises, and I knew this wasn't over. But for the first time, we weren't on the defensive. We were claiming what was always ours. And the echo of that truth was louder than any HOA vote or development proposal. It was ancestral, it was rooted, and it had just begun to speak. The following morning unfolded like a curtain rising on a stage that everyone suddenly realized had been set long ago. The air was cool, dry, and deliberate. The kind of day where even the lake looked like it was holding its posture. I was already up, pacing the length of the dock with a second cup of coffee that had long gone cold. I hadn't slept. Not really. Sleep was replaced by a rolling tide of strategy and memory. Today was not a day for surprise. It was a day for execution. Martin called at 8:03 a.m. sharp, his voice practically vibrating with something that sounded suspiciously like satisfaction. "The title search is complete," he said. "No ambiguities, no gaps, no unresolved transitions. You own it. Jack, the lake, the shoreline, and yes, the entire parking lot, the clubhouse and beach squarely within the perimeter. Legally speaking, they've built their HOA headquarters and primary amenities entirely on your land. The irony writes itself. I didn't say anything at first. The reality of what that meant had to settle not just in my chest, but in the entire arc of what had come before. They tried to evict me, called my home a blemish on their landscape. Now their polished temple to exclusivity sat squarely on land they didn't even own. I asked Martin what our next move was. He didn't hesitate. I've prepared 2 documents. One notice of jurisdictional challenge to stop any further eviction threats. 2 notice of trespass and unauthorized construction. We deliver them today. 5 o'clock. They have another board session scheduled this evening, and I suggest we interrupt it with precision. I hung up and sat at the edge of the dock, legs dangling over water that shimmered with a clarity I hadn't seen in weeks. The lake looked cleaner somehow, like truth itself had rinsed it overnight. I could hear the faint buzz of leaf blowers from across the water, HOA landscapers grooming the beach for weekend traffic, workers prepping lounge chairs, restocking the little shed they called a clubhouse convenience center. All of it happening on property they never had the right to touch. At 4:15, right on schedule, Martin pulled up in that same dignified Mercedes, stepping out in the same setup he wore like a uniform of quiet rebellion. He handed me the folder. I looked inside. Neatly organized, legal, unflinching. "Are you ready to walk into the lion's den?" he asked. "Not just walk," I replied. "I plan to redecorate it." We didn't go in through the main doors. Instead, we approached from the lakeside patio, stepping onto the stone pathway like we belonged there because we did. Earl and Margaret had done more than their part. Word had spread. Nearly a dozen cabin owners were already assembled just outside the clubhouse, casually talking, drinking lemonade, pretending not to be a growing wall of witnesses. They didn't have signs, but they didn't need them. Their very presence was a statement. We're still here. We were here first, and we're not going anywhere. Inside, the board was already seated, papers rustling, laptops open, small talk subdued. Victoria sat with her hands folded, but her posture rigid. She'd been expecting something, just not this. When Martin and I entered, the room didn't fall silent, it snapped. Tension coiled around the ceiling beams. Victoria raised her head and offered the same smile she'd used when trying to buy me out. It was brittle now, like glass stretched too thin. "Mr. Edwards," she said evenly, "if this is about your recent communications, I assure you our legal team is all ready." "It's not about communication," Martin interrupted. "It's about action. And today we bring 2. He placed the documents in front of her with the kind of precision that made people stop breathing. Richard reached for them immediately, flipping through the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with each paragraph. The rest of the board began to lean forward as if the words had gravitational pull. "This first notice," Martin said, "formally halts all eviction proceedings against Mr. Edwards. Your claim to jurisdiction over his cabin is invalid due to procedural errors in the boundary annexation. You failed to notify affected owners directly, relying instead on inadequate public postings. The incorporation was flawed, and we are prepared to challenge it in court." Victoria opened her mouth, but Martin raised a hand. "The second notice pertains to this very clubhouse, the beach area, and the parking lot outside, all of which were developed on property deeded in 1923 to Joseph Edwards and passed down through the Edwards family to Jack Edwards, who holds the current title. You have constructed on private land without a lease, without compensation, and without legal authority." The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was dense, suffocating, the kind that roared in your ears because no one dared break it. One of the board members, a woman in her 50s with silver-rimmed glasses, looked genuinely stunned. "Is this true?" she asked Richard directly. He didn't answer, which was an answer. Victoria turned to him, eyes wild. "You said everything was clean? You said the lake was public or assumed under county jurisdiction? We checked the residential lot lines." Richard said, voice low, "The shoreline was never questioned." "Then you didn't check thoroughly enough," Martin said calmly. "But we did." I stepped forward. "You tried to erase my home because it didn't match your vision. You built your empire on land you never owned. And now you want to pretend it's a misunderstanding. It's not. It's theft dressed in granite countertops and gated entrances." Richard stood, now clearly angry. "We can negotiate a purchase. This doesn't have to become a legal circus." No, I said, you can lease the land you have already paved over. You can honor the history that was here before your floor plans. Or we can see how your investors feel about lawsuits, injunctions, and press coverage about illegal development. Victoria looked at me with something that almost resembled fear. But underneath that, there was something else: calculation. She was already shifting gears, working on Plan B. We'll need time to consult with legal, she said. Of course, Martin replied, but be advised trespass notices take effect immediately. Every vehicle in the parking lot is currently on Jack's private property. You can't be serious, she snapped. I'm deadly serious, but I'm also flexible. What you do next determines how flexible I stay. We turned and left. Outside, the cabin owners waited, eyes searching our faces. Earl stepped forward. How'd it go? I gave him a smile that had weight behind it. They've been officially informed. The land speaks now, not just us. That night, I returned to the cabin and sat alone by the fireplace. Fire crackling, paper spread on the table like a map of war. I looked out through the window at the lake, now dark and rippling under moonlight. They had tried to push us out with rules. Now they would have to stay in by permission. And as the first stars appeared over Pine Lake, I realized something: I hadn't just defended a piece of land. I had reclaimed a legacy, and the battle was no longer survival. It was restoration. By mid-July, the war had settled into something colder than silence paperwork. Where once there had been fury, shouted boardroom objections, threats of legal escalation, veiled insults wrapped in property jargon, now there were carefully worded emails and tense mediation sessions in rooms that smelled like air conditioning and filtered coffee. The news of the land ownership revelation had spread faster than HOA propaganda, first through the cabin community like a spark to dry leaves, then across town, then into the inboxes of local journalists who'd been starved for a story that didn't involve bake sales or weather anomalies. But I didn't give interviews. I didn't post on social media. I didn't need to. The lake did the talking. Its stillness had become defiance. Its shoreline, the legal boundary that now redefined every inch of HOA infrastructure, became a quiet negotiation tool. Because once they realized the truth, once their own lawyers confirmed it, once the board saw in black and white that the clubhouse, beach, and parking lot weren't just technically misplaced, but fully trespassing, the narrative changed. It had to. Victoria Wellington, for all her pride and pretense, stopped showing up at public functions. Her signature no longer appeared at the bottom of board memos. Richard, however, became the new face of diplomacy, showing up at my dock one humid afternoon in what I assumed was his version of casual attire designer loafers, rolled sleeves, and the cautious body language of a man who knew he was standing on someone else's property. Jack. He began, not with apology, but with calibration. We've reviewed everything. The documents are, as you said, unambiguous. I've spoken with our legal team and, well, we'd like to propose a solution, one that benefits everyone. I let him talk. Let him lay out the numbers, the leasing terms, the years, the clauses. I watched him sweat just enough to break the illusion of control, but not enough to look weak. He offered a 99-year lease agreement for the HOA to continue using the facilities they'd built, in exchange for formal recognition of my ownership and exemption of the original cabins from aesthetic compliance regulations. He framed it as fairness. I saw it for what it was: a truce carved from desperation. I told him I'd consider it. Then I brought it to the cabin owners. Earl hosted the meeting under the wide oak in front of his porch, lemonade sweating on the table between us, faces worn by time and sun gathered in the shade like a jury of memory. I explained the terms: how their homes would be protected, how no one could force them to upgrade vinyl siding or install security-approved lighting or remove docks built before HOA bylaws were even imagined. The look on Margaret's face when I said permanent exemption was something I'll remember forever. Relief softened her features in a way that made her look 10 years younger. What's the catch? Someone asked. There isn't one. I said, they rent the land they stole. We keep the homes they tried to erase. No one needed a vote. History doesn't require consensus when it's that clear. The agreement was signed a week later. Martin handled the legal choreography, making sure every paragraph served the community and not just me. The HOA would lease the land beneath their crown jewel amenities for a symbolic but binding fee, an annual payment structured not for profit but for permanence. In exchange, the lake's original cabin's mine. Earl's, the Johnsons, the Willoughbys, every weathered structure that had once been deemed non-compliant were designated a historical district, shielded from future development pressures. But the most significant change wasn't written in contracts, it was structural. A new governing board was formed for the lake itself, one with equal representation from the HOA and the cabin owners. No more unilateral decisions. No more rezoning and shadows. No more silence. The first joint meeting was awkward. Old tensions hung in the air like unspoken accusations. But they didn't speak. Not at first. They listened. That was new, and that was enough. On the last Saturday of August, I hosted a cookout at the cabin. It wasn't planned like an event, it just happened. People brought coolers. Someone started the grill. Someone else brought folding chairs. Earl played old records from a battery-powered speaker, and Margaret handed out slices of peach cobbler like she was deputizing happiness. The Johnsons laughed until they cried. The Willoughbys brought their grandkids. And when Martin arrived, carrying a six-pack and a grin, someone handed him a folding chair and called him a hero. He blushed like a kid. As the sun dipped behind the trees and gold spilled across the lake like warm syrup, Earl raised a glass. To Jack, he said, who reminded us that sometimes David doesn't just beat Goliath. Sometimes David owns the damn battlefield. The laughter that followed wasn't loud, it was deep. It came from somewhere safe, somewhere restored. I stood by the water's edge that night, barefoot in the grass, watching the clubhouse across the lake. Its lights reflected on the surface like a surrendered crown. It still stood tall, but it stood differently now quietly. Not as a symbol of control, but as a tenet of a shared story. Richard had started showing up more, not just at meetings, but at the lake itself, fishing with residents, helping clean debris after storms, even attending a cabin potluck once, though he brought store-bought dip and served it in crystal. But the gesture mattered. He was trying. Victoria, on the other hand, had disappeared from community life almost entirely. Rumor had it she was spending more time in their other home, somewhere far more polished, far less complicated. I didn't begrudge her the exit. Sometimes people don't want to be part of stories where they don't get to write all the lines. One night, sitting beside the fire pit, Martin turned to me and said something that stuck. Your grandfather once told me that land isn't just a possession. It's a responsibility. You honored that. Jack, you didn't just protect a boundary, you preserved a story. I nodded. I've been thinking about that a lot. What came next? What happened after the fight was over? After the community was safe? I looked out at the lake, now glistening under a canopy of stars, and said, I'm thinking of setting up a conservation trust, something permanent, so the lake never has to be defended like this again. Martin smiled. That's the right ending. It's not an ending, I said. It's a safeguard for whoever comes after. Because in the end, legacy isn't just what you protect, it's what you pass forward. Pine Lake had changed, not because it wanted to, but because it had to. Because enough people stood still when everything tried to push them out. And now, for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a battlefront. It felt like a home, the kind that remembers, the kind that forgives, the kind that endures.